Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for the second speaker, Professor Fatih. Okay, next, our Honorable third speaker, Dr. James Gomez, from Region Director, Asia Center, Thailand. I will explain the CV. Dr. James Gomez, as a Regional Director, Asia Center, Bangkok, Thailand, and not-for-profit social enterprise that seeks to create human rights impact in the region. And Dr. Gomez brings to Asia Center over 25 years of the international and region experience in leadership roles at universities, think tank, intergovernmental agency, and not a governmental organization. He obtained a PhD from Monash University, Australia, and MA from the University of Essex, United Kingdom, and BSc and SGL, National University of Singapore. And Dr. Gomez led the research on Asia Center's human rights baseline study, COVID-19 and democracy in Southeast Asia. Okay, give applause to third speaker. Okay. Okay.
Selamat siang, and thank you everyone for having me. And we had several interesting interventions. So let me just start off by kind of responding to some of the interventions that came before me. I was actually concerned, when the Minister of Human Rights and Law, brought attention to the different agreements we have had at the ASEAN level. One of the things that concerned me, and that could be sort of a jumping board to get into the discussion today, would be around extradition and the transfer of sentenced people. Because right there, in developing, the building blocks of a regional integration, what are the rights building block? I think that's something to be concerned about. Obviously, COVID-19 has disrupted the countries, economically, socially, but of course, the politics, democracy, and human rights is also important. And we need to, and my conversation here would really be about deep diving into this dimension. I think COVID-19 has disrupted political competition. Emergency laws, other temporary laws, directives have been used to put political opponents in the corner. The media has been reeled in, internet freedoms have been disrupted. We also need to speak about academic freedoms and finally the sustainabilities of CSO. I think one of the discussions we need to kind of put on the surface is how are CSOs doing as they are also feeling the impact of COVID-19. In the context of talking about, business and trade in ASEAN, we also need to kind of, mainstream the UN guiding principle and business and human rights. I think there are some discussions, but the state of national action plans are still quite weak. When we talk about internet for business, as we've seen in the case of Myanmar, the issue of connectivity and privacy of data is also important. If we talk about social safety net, what are the alternative policies, and are we allowing for political competition so that competing parties and civil society can also offer counter narrative and policy ideas? And then the ability to criticize. Often in the region, one has to be constructive or neutral. In fact, if you offer even, well-meaning policy alternatives, the receivers will always demand that you are neutral, right? And then, of course, the lack of alignment to international standards, human rights, both in terms of policy and practice. And I think it's also important to recognize when we talk about the fissures in Myanmar that we continue to see, we also need to recognize these fissures continue because countries in the region and beyond continue to do business with the regime, continue to host the generals and their networks in their own countries, and are mostly concerned about their own, business and political self-interest. So, initially responding to the conversations before me, what I thought, looking at your conference brief, there were 4 questions that kind of jumped to me. The first one is a legal personality possible, given that the political culture among the elites of ASEAN is to use their own moral codes, flexibility, and an informal approach? Would they want independent oversight by international instruments or the regional one, when most member states detest independent checks and balances, or when introduced, actively try to water them down? The national human rights institutions are examples in the region. While COVID-19 has had an impact on the progress of many initiatives in relation to human rights protection, I would venture to say it had no impact on ASEAN legal integration, as there was not much there to begin with to have an impact anyway. And if we want to speak of legal integration, are we speaking about an emerging authoritarian regional framework based on the already piecemeal regional cooperation framework so far that need to be examined further? My remarks for the next few minutes are drawn from the work that Asia Center has been doing in the last few years. They cover mostly a review of the UPR of ASEAN member states, the NHRIs where they have some or where they don't, the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, and also the SDG journey, especially looking deeply at some of the VNRs. Our key observation so far is the following. First, I think ASEAN states, when you look at the documentation, right, they always express a belief in human rights, even though, practice is far from perfect. Usually, at the UPR, country reviews, they usually frame it in a very overtly broad statement. Most ASEAN states will emphasize the balance between human rights and responsibility, or between freedom and public order. While human rights demands accountability and rule of law to function, the reality is the operating norms of political leaders in the region is characterized by the impunity of the elites, where behind the scenes political transactions or race-based clientelism, reign supreme. So one of the things, we have to observe when we are dealing, and we are really, it's a discourse with the elites, they're quick in these formal forums to articulate a belief in human rights, but in practice is real. So we need to recognize and call that out. The second, flag they would wave would be the national constitutions. Here, they will point to human rights pledges or provisions in national law, in particular the Constitution, and make motherhood statements which do not actually in practice respect or protect the rights of the citizens in real terms. Oftentimes, you'll find these documents confine legal rights and protection only to national citizens. So those, and of course, sometimes those professing the dominant religion. So refugees, undocumented workers, foreigners often, do not, share the same rights. They will also point to specific laws that they roll out, such as media laws, internet laws, even public assembly laws. Media laws, licensing will be introduced, Education and training requirements for journalists may be introduced. Security deposits for media companies, especially for alternative media online organizations, may be introduced. And these are all will be presented as facilitating greater media access. But then as soon as the laws are operational, it's used against either the individuals or the companies. Increasingly, we see, the registration of service providers for the internet, and then requests for data retention. What is even more problematic is sometimes data is shared between different, ministries and government agencies. So the privacy of data of the individual citizens and increasingly foreign residents, it's not protected. Finally, with public assemblies, we will look at notification, prior notification being required, limitations on the size of the assembly, and also the requirement to have security personnel at your own cost to manage a public activity. Then we have laws for the registration of civil society. They are sometimes known as NGO laws, or if you follow the British tradition, the Societies Act. So these also further not only place some reporting burdens on these organizations, they also cut off funding. So the level of policing around the region so far individually, and when we talk about integration, I just want to point out that when we talk about regional integration, when these things come together, are we also looking at an authoritarian regional framework that we need to address? I mentioned earlier also NHRI, the region struggles to roll out, one in each of the countries. And I have other colleagues, I think, are more well informed to speak of this issue regionally. But we've only have 5 or 6 if we include East Timor, and they continue to have challenges in terms of being independent, following the Paris principles, appointing people independently, representatively, and also having the budget to run. And also many of these NHRIs around the region also have regional coordinating centers or offices. Sometimes it's not clear if those, managing or heading those, provincial or regional centers are, fluent in what the tasks are, or are they confused? There's also this, speak to exceptionalism, using size, we are too small, so we are not able to do this. We are underdeveloped, our economy is not so strong or good, so rights are not a priority. We have security issues, cross-border issues, internal conflicts, national interest. Let's pursue this according to our national interest, and you pursue it according to your national interest, and therefore things come to become hung. And finally, to framing our call for rights or rights observation as not being possible because the persons or organizations that we speak for have actually committed illegal acts, which in itself problematic because many of the national laws are very unjust. And then using the notion of cultural norms, saying, our communities are fragile because they are diverse, and our religious and culture, demonstrate a non-conformity or non-compatibility to some of the rights requirements placed by the international community or international standards. And one of my favorites is really this whole, fake politeness, or in Bahasa we call sandiwara, where, everybody is polite to each other and, don't call out the elephant in the room. I think one of the key concerns is really that the whole approach to, ASEAN integration is a statist, diplomatic-driven elite behavior. And that, I think, is a key leader in framing and providing the discourse around ASEAN integration. As a result, the focus tends to be on military cooperation, economic cooperation, often with the political elites. Diplomats are risk aversive. They explain risk aversive behavior and sometimes ideologically aligned behavior. So that doesn't help. Even academics are problematic because, especially those who work in public and private universities, universities that have more sort of policing of academic activities, who are, institutions that are more state-centered. You will find academics here also tend to be risk aversive. So I think because of this, it has been led this way, and I think we need to sort of raise the people's voices and also have a more CSO centered or mainstream approach to the conversation about rights and regional integration. So as a way of wrapping up, I want to say, my concern is really that if we, lose the eye on the ball, so to speak, what we will see is the institutionalization of a trans-border authoritarianism. And I think I will end by saying three things. One, we have to recognize the risk and the possible, gathering of, a coalition, towards this form of integration. And if this is happening, and my sense is it is, we have to sort of push hard to ensure that a rights framework accompanies any integration. Otherwise, we will find that suddenly, our rights are gone, and we'll be easily shipped across the region just because, they have signed extradition orders and so on, especially when it comes to political matters. And that finally, the people-to-people involvement is increased as in all conversations about ASEAN integration, and not leave it only in the hands of the elites. With that, I'll rest my remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Big applause to our third speaker. Okay, thank you, Dr.